Okay, welcome to the first chapter in Unit 4, Chapter 10, Business in a Global Economy presentation lecture. We will be going through both sections 10.1 and 10.2 in this presentation lecture. So make sure that you have your note guide so that you can complete the notes as we go through this chapter's material. All right, let's get started. All right, so when it comes to a global marketplace, which is what the world has become, a lot of trade and business amongst different countries on a global scale, currently meaning that we live in a global economy, and a global economy has to be fueled by international trade. Now, when the global economy is developed, that is considered globalization. So, with the emergence of technology, global economy and international trade have obviously exploded onto the scene in the way that different items can be traded in terms of imports and exports with different countries in providing goods and services for consumers. Now, a global economy is the interconnected economies of the nations of the world, whereas international trade is the exchange of goods and services between these nations. That's the imports and exports. Now, Sony is an example of a multinational corporation. Sony is ironically, one of the organizations for the corporate social responsibility scandals that you did in your previous project. But a multinational corporation is a company that does business in many countries and has facilities and offices around the world. So they might have stationed headquarters in different parts of the world. However, they will always have a main headquarters or possibly a corporate headquarters in one particular country. Most likely, in this case, it is Japan. Sony is a Japanese founded company. Now let's take a look at international trade. Before we can take a look at international trade, let's first define what trade is. Trade is going to allow countries to be able to meet individual needs and wants in order to help their own economies as well as economies around the world. Now, trade is a specific area of business or industry. It is a skilled occupation. People who work in a specific area of business or industry. So this is, when it comes to trade, we're looking at goods and services that come from one place and go to a next. You're going to hear me talk a lot about imports and exports, and we will get into those specifically, but this all revolves around import and export. So different types of trade. We have domestic trade. This is goods and services within a country, so we have that. Then there's also world trade, which is exchanging goods and services on an international scale, so going to different countries such as Canada, Mexico, possibly over into Europe and into Asia. Here we go, imports and exports. That's what I was referring to earlier. One country's imports are another country's exports. So imports is goods and services coming in, whereas exports are goods and services going out. So exports we sell to another country, imports we purchase from another country. Now, in the United States, there are a couple of major imports and exports that the United States is known for and does a lot of business. For example, when it comes to imports, that is the bars in blue. Notice how we import a lot of fuel. But when it comes to exports, our biggest export is agricultural products. So we are actually, if you take a look at this graph and summarize the entire graph, we are importing a lot more goods and services than we are exporting, which is an interesting dynamic when it comes to global economy, and we'll touch upon that later. Now, balance of trade. This is where we're looking at balancing the amount of imports and exports that a country is producing and receiving. So the United States, interesting enough, has a favorable balance of trade with Australia. This is the difference in value between a country's imports and exports over a period of time. So the balance of trade with Australia is good. However, from a global scale, we are definitely importing a lot more than we are exporting. In a situation where we have a trade surplus, this means a country exports more than it imports. Honestly, we are not in that type of a scenario based off of that previous graph. Our scenario is more along the lines of a trade deficit, which is a country's imports exceeds its exports. Now, a country might specialize. Specialization is basically means to focus on a particular activity, area, or product. Different countries will specialize in different trade goods, And they might trade some of the items that they produce in order to obtain other countries' goods and services. So it almost relates back to a bartering system, which was the first system in place which reflected an economy trade place. So even though bartering is something of the past, it still in some cases does exist, especially within a global economy. Now, when it comes to specialization, resources are needed, and any country that is going to specialize will most likely have a comparative advantage. Now, a comparative advantage, this is a concept that we will be covering a little bit more in detail, but it is the ability of a country to produce particular good more effectively than any other country or company. So a comparative advantage is very similar to a competitive advantage, where basically you're looking at providing a good or services and it is better than any of your competitors or anybody else who produces that good or service, making you top of the line, the comparative advantage. Currency. Let's talk about currency. So when we're trading with other countries, we have different currencies that these countries are using. So to trade with another country, businesses must convert their money into that nation's currency. So if we were trading with a European country, we might have to trade the US dollar and convert it into euros or vice versa. Currency is exchanged on the foreign exchange market. That is where the currency gets changed from one currency to the other to solidify and complete a transaction. Now the exchange rate, the price at which one currency can buy another currency. So these fluctuate depending upon the value of the US dollar and how it relates to other currencies around the world in terms of value. So they change from day to day and from country to country. The exchange rate has to be monitored when it comes to global trade. A little bit more here on currency. What we also need to remember is that companies follow the exchange rates to find the best prices for products. So they monitor this to determine what to import, what to export, and not only what, but also when. When is going to be the best time to do this? A country with an appreciated exchange rate can buy more of another country's products. If the exchange rate is low, countries are going to want to buy. If the exchange rate is high, countries are going to want to sell. All right, let's move on then from section 1 into section 2. So if we move into section 2 is going to be discussing global competition. So how do we compete on a global scale? When it comes to competition and free trade, we have this concept known as protectionism. This is global competition, which often leads to trade disputes. We have the free trade agreement. We have NAFTA that was put in place by Bill Clinton. We also have embargoes and sanctions that might be put in order to monitor trade. So protectionism and free trade are two opposing points of view involved in trade disputes. And these things are working against each other on a daily basis. Let's first break down protectionism. Japan practices this technique. And they do it in their export products of rice farming and auto production. Now, protectionism defined is the practice of the government putting limits on foreign trade to protect businesses at home. So they're trying to protect or at least be able to secure the ability for these home businesses to be profitable by bringing in the global economy and opening it up to a number of different competitors worldwide. It's going to be very, very difficult to be profitable. Not that it's impossible, it's just going to be more difficult to do so, which is the reason for this concept known as protectionism. All right, reasons to restrict trade. These are some of the things that countries put into place or at least think about when they restrict trade. Foreign competition can lower the demand of products made at home. So there's always that supply and demand teeter-totter that's going back and forth. And when supply meets demand, profits are at their best. When one is greater than the other, if you have a greater demand or if you have a greater supply, now you can have shortages or surpluses and profits will decline. Companies at home need to be protected from unfair competition. If you're talking about apples to oranges in terms of industrial regulations from one country to the next, China is allowed to pollute a lot more, which means that their industrial output might be a little bit faster than ours. We might be restricted by some of our EPA laws that are put in place restricting certain pollutions. Industries that make product related to national defense need to be protected as well, because those are some secrets that are needed in order to protect our citizens and also our homeland. And so those secrets do not need to be shared in certain cases so that people can exploit them with malicious intent. Now, the use of cheap labor in other countries can lower wages and threaten jobs at home. We've seen that happen. There's a lot of different organizations that have moved production outside of the borders of the United States in order to take part and thrive on these cheapened labor costs. A country can become too dependent on another country for important goods. We have seen that happen in terms of energy prices, especially with oil over the past number of years, where we have been so dependent upon importing oil that when the prices spiked, there was a big outcry here in the United States, and it took a while for that market to stabilize itself. Other countries might not have the same environmental or human rights standards. So again, basically what it comes down to is reasons to restrict trade is because you cannot compare apples to oranges. If you have to compare apples to apples, that's a little bit different, but that is the reasons why trade is restricted. Now, different ways of protectionism. One thing that might be put in place is a tariff. This is a trade barrier. A tariff is a tax placed on imports to increase their price in the domestic market. So you can import goods, but we are going to mark it up for you to purchase it and sell it at your homeland. Therefore, in order for you to be profitable, you're going to have to increase the price when you sell it within the borders of your own country. So tariffs can be significant impact or have a significant impact on a global economy as well as a local economy. Also, quota. Quota is another example for trade barrier. We know quota as a number of particular output devices in a particular period of time. However, another definition is a limit placed on the quantities of a product that can be imported. So only X amount of items can be imported for X amount of time. So very, very similar to what we know as a common definition for quota, just applying it in a different manner. There's also embargoes. Now, this is a trade barrier that usually used political or military reasons. So a ban on an import or export of a product because of military implications. That's an embargo. So make sure that when we're looking at different elements of protectionism, we realize the difference between embargo, tariffs, and some of those other key economic concepts that are in place when it comes to globalized trade. Free trade. This is what we have in place right now, put in place by Bill Clinton back in the early 90s. Free trade, all countries should be able to free to compete anywhere without restrictions. When a free trade agreement like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is in place, when there are few or no limits on trade between countries, which means apples to oranges doesn't matter. Hey, let's trade. You need it, we've got it, you want it, we can provide it, kind of a thing. And then a deal is made. Now, there's also benefits of free trade, such as opens up new markets in other countries. Free trade creates new jobs, and competition forces businesses to become more efficient and more productive, meaning a much better service provided to the consumer. Also, consumers have more choices in the variety of prices and quality of goods. Free trade is also going to promote cultural understanding and encourages countries to cooperate with each other and also realize some of those cultural differences. And free trade is going to help countries raise their standard of living, working with other countries, communicating, becoming more of a team type atmosphere. So there are benefits to free trade, no doubt about it. Now, to reduce limits on trade, nations form trade alliances. This is NAFTA. This is the one I mentioned before, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which combined the economies of the United States, Canada, and Mexico for free trade. We are very close in proximity, so why not free trade with each other? It makes some sense. Some people oppose NAFTA because they feared that some workers would be displaced, trade barriers would be lowered, and of course the loss of jobs is obviously a big concern when it comes to economic balance and the rate of unemployment. Now, trade alliances, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, is the one that we have with Canada and Mexico. The European Union, EU, those countries are involved in that one. And then also the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which those countries are taking part in for free trade. And that concludes the presentation lecture on Chapter 10. Please make sure that you review the slides to make sure that you have everything in your notes that is needed and you are prepared for our next class period. In that case, I will leave it here, and I will see you in class next time we meet.